Hey everyone, tonight we'll delve into a name that was never meant to be spoken aloud, a name once carved into soft clay beneath a dying moon, and then buried as if even the earth feared remembering it. You find yourself standing in the dim glow of an oil lamp, where the air hangs heavy with the scent of burnt myrrh and damp river wind, while a trembling scribe presses his stylus into a tablet that should never have been made. Each mark appears uneven and strained, as though the clay itself resists the act of recording what must not endure. And yet the name is there, Lamashtu. Outside, the temple bells attempt to ring, but something disrupts their rhythm, causing them to falter in a way that feels disturbingly alive. Beneath your feet, there is a faint sound, subtle but undeniable, like iron brushing slowly against bone, hidden under layers of stone and time. You probably won't want to believe what you are about to hear, because this is not merely a tale of a demon queen from ancient Mesopotamian myth, but a story about a curse that priests once tried to erase and could not. So, before the tension gets too high, take a moment to like the episode and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you are listening from somewhere in the world, share your location and local time, because knowing where you stand may matter more than you think before stepping further into this story. Now close your eyes, imagine the ancient mountains, and let's unravel this epic tale together. The tablet you hold reflects reality more than legend, as fragments like it have been uncovered in the ruins of Nineveh, where vast Assyrian libraries once preserved the knowledge of deities and ancient mysteries. Lamashtu appears in historical incantations as a child-stealing entity, yet some carvings depict her in a far stranger form, nursing both a piglet and a dog at once, turning the idea of motherhood into something deeply unnatural. One line repeats across the surface with deliberate force: "Oaths live in the cut." Near the edge, carved deeper than all the rest, a warning remains unfinished yet unmistakable, urging the reader never to complete the name. But someone already did, and now you have seen it with your own eyes. So consider this carefully. If a forbidden name was waiting to be completed, was it ever truly unfinished, or was it waiting for you? The name lingers in your mind longer than it should, as though it has weight, as though it presses inward, rather than fading away. And now you begin to understand why the ancient scribes feared not just speaking it, but even remembering it. Long before Lamashtu became a whispered terror in Mesopotamian households, she was counted among the daughters of Anu, the sky god whose authority stretched across both divine order and celestial law. In the oldest layers of Akkadian belief, beings born of Anu were not meant to descend into chaos, yet Lamashtu did not follow the pattern that defined the other deities. You move deeper into the temple archive, where cracked tablets lie stacked like bones of forgotten thought, and one fragment reveals a detail that feels almost impossible to reconcile with her later form. It describes her not as a monster, but as a figure of unsettling autonomy, a deity who acted without permission, who crossed boundaries that even gods treated as sacred thresholds. In a world where roles among deities were fixed and carefully maintained, this alone marked her as dangerous long before she ever harmed a mortal child. There is a peculiar detail preserved in several incantation texts, one that scholars often dismiss as symbolic, yet it lingers with strange persistence. Lamashtu is said to have worn a necklace of tiny carved hands, each one representing an action taken without divine consent, as though she collected her own defiance and displayed it openly. This is not the behavior of a mindless demon, but of something far more unsettling, a being aware of law and choosing to break it. A faint draft passes through the chamber, carrying with it the distant scent of marsh water and something older, something metallic and dry, and you begin to sense that her fall was not sudden, but deliberate. If Lamashtu was born divine and chose transgression, then the question shifts into something far more troubling. What could a daughter of the sky possibly want that the heavens themselves would deny her? The answer does not arrive as a clear record, but as fragments that resist alignment, scattered across tablets cracked by time and silence, as though even history refused to preserve the moment cleanly. You trace one such fragment with your fingers, its edges worn smooth, and the inscription speaks not of war or rebellion in the way Greek mythology or Norse legends might describe divine conflict among gods, but of something quieter and far more unsettling, a boundary crossed without permission, at a place where even deities were expected to pause. You begin to see it unfold. There is a threshold in the old Mesopotamian cosmology, a liminal space between the upper heavens of Anu and the domains below, where decisions are not made but weighed. Ancient temple hymns refer to it as the still gate, a place where even divine footsteps were said to make no sound. It was here, according to one surviving line, that Lamashtu acted. The tablet does not describe violence, yet the absence of detail feels intentional, like a silence enforced rather than accidental. It states only that she took what was not given and gave what was not asked, a phrase repeated in multiple incantation traditions, suggesting a shared memory of a single transgression that no one dared to fully record. Among Babylonian protective texts, this phrase later became a warning recited over cradles, as though the original act had something to do with the exchange of life itself. A bizarre detail emerges in a lesser-known ritual commentary, one that claims Lamashtu's shadow did not follow her as she crossed the threshold, but instead remained behind, pressed into the stone like a stain that could not be removed. Priests would later treat shadows as witnesses in exorcism rites, a practice rooted in this very moment. The air around you grows colder, as though the temple remembers what the tablets refused to say, and a realization settles slowly into place. This was not a fall caused by punishment, but by choice. If she crossed the boundary willingly, knowing the cost, then what did she take from that silent gate that was worth losing the heavens forever? The answer begins not in the heavens, but in the lowlands where the rivers loosen their grip on the earth, where the Euphrates spills into marsh and reed, and where the boundary between water and land refuses to remain fixed. You find yourself drawn there in the telling, to the southern reaches of ancient Sumer, where early settlements rose on mudbrick and faith, and where the oldest stories were whispered not in temples, but in the shifting breath of wetlands that seemed alive with memory. It is here that Lamashtu first descends, not in fire, nor in thunder, but in silence that bends the reeds without wind, a presence that moves through shallow water without disturbing its surface. The marshes were long believed to be thresholds in Mesopotamian belief, places where spirits crossed more easily, and even today archaeologists note how these regions preserved some of the oldest ritual practices tied to both protection and appeasement. The people who lived here understood that certain forces did not arrive with spectacle, but with absence, with things that should be there and suddenly were not. A strange detail survives in an early incantation recovered near describing how Lamashtu's footprints, when they appeared in wet clay, pointed backward, as though she walked against her own direction, confusing both prey and priest alike. This detail was not treated as metaphor, but as instruction, and for centuries, exorcists would walk backward during certain rites to avoid drawing her attention. You move through the imagined marsh, hearing the distant call of water birds and the slow ripple of unseen movement beneath the surface, and there is a growing awareness that this was not merely a descent into the human world, but a claiming of territory. The heavens had lost her, but the earth had not yet understood what it had gained. Somewhere in the reeds, something watches without eyes. And if the marsh was her first foothold among mortals, then why did she choose a place where nothing ever stays, in one form for long? The marsh does not keep records, but the cities do, and it is in the structured silence of Babylonian ritual practice that Lamashtu begins to take on a form that can be resisted if not understood. You return from the shifting wetlands into a chamber of fired brick and carved stone, where an exorcist priest kneels before a low altar, arranging objects with deliberate precision, each one placed according to instructions preserved across generations. Among them lies a small clay tablet unlike the others, etched with a figure so detailed and so deliberate that it feels less like art and more like containment. This is the ritual tablet of 7 faces. Archaeologists have uncovered similar plaques across Mesopotamia, often buried beneath thresholds or placed near cradles, each depicting Lamashtu with a grotesque composite form, the head of a lioness, the teeth of a donkey, the ears of something not entirely animal, and a body that defies clean description. In this version, however, her image is divided into 7 aspects, each face turned in a different direction, as though she exists not in a single moment, but across many at once. The priest's fingers hesitate before touching it, because these are not merely representations, but instructions on how to perceive her. A bizarre detail accompanies these depictions in several incantation texts, noting that Lamashtu was believed to carry a comb and a spindle, tools associated with domestic life, yet she used them not to create, but to unravel, combing through unseen threads and spinning them backward. This inversion of ordinary objects made her especially feared, because it suggested she could enter the most intimate spaces of human life without resistance. The priest begins to chant, his voice low and rhythmic, invoking not just protection but recognition, as though naming each aspect might anchor something that refuses to stay still. The tablet trembles slightly in the lamplight, and for a moment it seems as though one of the carved faces is not aligned with the others. If she has 7 faces, each watching a different direction, then which one is turned toward you right now? The answer does not come from the temple, but from a house where no priest has yet arrived, where the night presses close against mud brick walls, and the quiet feels heavier than sleep should allow. You find yourself inside a modest dwelling in Nippur, a city known in Mesopotamian history as a sacred center devoted to Enlil, where rituals were meant to maintain order between the mortal and the divine. Yet here, in a single room lit only by a fading oil flame, that order has already begun to unravel. A mother stirs from uneasy rest, her breath catching before her eyes fully open, as though something has already reached her before consciousness can. The cradle beside her bed moves, not with the gentle rhythm of a waking child, but with a slow, irregular motion that feels wrong in a way the body recognizes before the mind does. When she leans closer, she does not scream, because what she sees does not present itself clearly enough to name. There is a hand. Not fully visible, not entirely real, but pressing down just enough to indent the cloth beside the infant as though something unseen has weight. The child's breathing is shallow, uneven, and in the silence, you can hear a faint sound that should not exist, a soft humming, like a lullaby remembered incorrectly. Historical incantations from Nippur describe Lamashtu as one who enters through the threshold unannounced, and protective amulets were often hung above cradles for this very reason. Yet in some accounts, these measures failed, not because they were performed incorrectly, but because something had already been invited without knowing it. A strange detail recorded in later texts claims that infants touched by Lamashtu would sometimes develop a faint mark behind the ear, shaped like a crescent bite, though no wound ever appeared. Priests debated whether this was a sign of possession or selection, and no agreement was ever reached. The mother reaches out, her hand trembling, unsure whether she is about to pull her child back into safety or deeper into something she cannot see. And as the humming grows slightly clearer, you begin to wonder, was this intrusion forced, or was the door opened long before this night began? By the time the priests arrive, the house no longer feels like part of Nippur, as though its walls have shifted slightly outside the order that Enlil was meant to protect, and even the air carries a stillness that resists prayer. You stand among them as they enter, their sandals brushing softly against the floor, their voices low, controlled, careful not to disturb whatever presence lingers just beyond sight. One of them carries a small tablet etched with invocations to Anu, the sky god, whose authority should in all proper order override lesser forces. But nothing answers. In Mesopotamian belief, Anu was distant but absolute, a deity whose silence was often interpreted as judgment rather than absence, and yet here, in a moment that calls for intervention, that silence feels different. The lead priest completes the invocation with precise articulation, each word shaped according to tradition, each breath measured, and still the room remains unchanged, as though the prayer has been heard but deliberately ignored. A fragment from an Assyrian ritual text comes to mind, one that speaks of a covenant not written in clay, an agreement among deities that certain forces would not be restrained once they crossed a particular boundary. Scholars have long debated whether this refers to Lamashtu, and standing here, you begin to feel that this is not merely speculation, but memory preserved in coded form. The child's breathing steadies for a moment, then falters again, and one of the priests lowers his gaze, not in confusion, but in recognition. He does not repeat the prayer. There is also a strange detail recorded in several incantations, noting that offerings made to Anu during Lamashtu-related rituals were sometimes left untouched, while offerings to lesser protective spirits showed signs of disturbance, as though the hierarchy itself had shifted under unseen pressure. The implication settles slowly, heavily, like dust that has waited too long to fall. If Anu remains silent not out of absence but agreement, then what was promised in that ancient covenant, and why was Lamashtu allowed to keep it? The priests do not speak the next name lightly, because unlike invocations to distant deities, this one is meant to be heard immediately, carried not upward into the heavens but outward into the moving air. The lead exorcist steps back from the cradle and reaches into a small leather pouch, drawing out an amulet carved with a snarling face, its features exaggerated into something both grotesque and commanding. You recognize it from museum fragments and excavation reports, the face of Pazuzu, the demon king of the southwest wind. In ancient Mesopotamian practice, Pazuzu was not worshipped in the way other deities were, yet his image was widely used as protection, especially against Lamashtu. This paradox has always unsettled scholars, because it suggests a system where one malevolent force is invoked to repel another, creating a balance that feels less like order and more like managed danger. The priest raises the amulet and begins a chant that is sharper, more forceful than the earlier prayers, as though it must cut through something rather than appeal to it. A sudden wind presses against the walls, though no door has opened. It carries the dry heat of distant deserts, along with a faint, acrid scent that stings the throat, and the oil flame flickers violently before steadying in a way that feels unnatural. Pazuzu, according to Assyrian inscriptions, was believed to command the winds that brought both plague and protection, a duality that made him both feared and necessary. There is a peculiar detail often overlooked in his depictions. His right hand is raised, palm outward, as if in warning, while his left points downward, suggesting not dominance, but direction, as though he governs passage between forces rather than opposing them outright. The child's breathing changes again, not calmer, but different, as though something has shifted position rather than retreated. The wind lingers, circling without dispersing, and for a moment it feels as though two presences now occupy the same unseen space. If Pazuzu is the only force Lamashtu avoids, then why does his arrival feel less like rescue and more like the opening of another door? The amulet does not simply rest in the priest's hand. It seems to settle into the space as though it has always belonged there, its presence altering the air in a way that feels structured rather than chaotic. The chanting continues, each syllable sharpened into a tool rather than a plea, and you begin to understand that invoking Pazuzu is not an act of faith, but of negotiation. In ancient Mesopotamian households, such amulets were often hung above doorways or placed near cradles, not out of devotion, but as a calculated risk, a decision to invite one danger in order to hold another at bay. The child's body stills, not with peace, but with a kind of suspended tension, as though something unseen has paused to observe the new arrival. The mother watches without moving, her fear now divided, no longer focused on a single presence, but stretched between two forces whose intentions she cannot distinguish. The priests do not reassure her because there is nothing in their training that promises safety, only outcomes that can be managed at a cost. A fragment from a Babylonian Incantation series suggests that wearing Pazuzu's likeness over the heart required a silent offering, something never spoken aloud, something given without witness. Some texts hint that this offering was not material, but personal, sleep, memory, or even the ability to dream without interruption. Over time, those who relied too heavily on such protection were said to develop a strange detachment, as though part of them had been quietly claimed. The amulet grows warm in the priest's grip, and the wind that entered the room begins to coil more tightly, no longer wandering, but circling with intent. There is a low sound beneath the chant now, something like distant breathing layered over the rhythm of the ritual. You begin to sense that this is not a battle, but an arrangement unfolding in real time. If Pazuzu's protection demands something unseen in return, then what has already been taken from this house before anyone realized a bargain had begun? Midnight does not arrive as a moment, but as a shift, a quiet turning in the texture of the air that every trained priest in Mesopotamia learns to recognize without needing to see the stars. The chamber is prepared with deliberate care, its floor marked by fine lines of ash and powdered clay, forming a boundary that is less a barrier than a declaration. You stand just outside that boundary now, aware that what is about to begin has been practiced for centuries, preserved in a series of incantations known as the Maqlû, a ritual tradition specifically designed to counter forces of sorcery, curse, and intrusion. 7 lamps are lit in a precise arrangement, their flames steady despite the lingering wind that should have disturbed them, and the lead exorcist begins the first of the 7 incantations. Each line is spoken slowly, with measured breath, because in this ritual, precision is not symbolic but functional. A misplaced word is not a mistake, it is an opening. Historical records from Assyrian sources describe the Maqlû series as one of the most elaborate anti-witchcraft ceremonies, often performed overnight and involving symbolic acts such as the burning of effigies, the washing of hands in consecrated water, and the recitation of long sequences of protective names. Yet here, something is different, because the focus is not on an unnamed witch or curse, but on a presence that has already entered the space and does not intend to leave. At the center of the ritual circle, a small clay effigy is placed, shaped crudely but intentionally, bearing exaggerated features that mirror the 7 aspects seen on the earlier tablet. It represents Lamashtu, but not as she is, rather as she must be understood in order to be bound. A strange detail noted in certain Maqlû commentaries suggests that such effigies were sometimes whispered to before being destroyed, as though the ritual required not just symbolic representation, but acknowledgement of awareness. The priest's voice deepens as he continues, the rhythm building, the air tightening with each phrase, and the flames begin to lean inward, drawn toward the center. If this ritual is meant to bind her name and presence, then why does it feel as though something is gathering strength instead of losing it? The fourth incantation does not end cleanly, and in that slight fracture of rhythm, the lead priest lifts his hand, signaling a transition that was never meant to occur so early. You feel it before you understand it, a pull not from within the chamber but from beyond its walls, from the direction of the river that has shaped both the land and its rituals for generations. The Euphrates, known not only as a source of life but as a boundary between seen and unseen domains, now becomes part of the rite. The effigy is lifted carefully, wrapped in linen marked with protective symbols, and placed into a shallow clay vessel. You follow as the priests move in silence through the narrow streets, their path lit only by the trembling glow of carried lamps. Historical accounts describe similar nocturnal processions, where exorcists would carry cursed objects to flowing water, believing that rivers could carry away what could not be destroyed by fire alone. The night air is cooler near the riverbank, and the sound of moving water creates a constant undertone, a low murmur that seems almost responsive. One priest steps into the shallows, his garments darkening as the current presses against him, and he holds the vessel just above the surface, waiting for a precise moment dictated not by time, but by sensation. There is a strange instruction recorded in certain ritual fragments, stating that the carrier of the effigy must not think of their own name while crossing into the water, as identity itself could anchor the curse rather than release it. This is not symbolic advice, but a rule followed with absolute seriousness. You notice the priest's lips moving silently, not in chant but in absence, as though he is actively refusing thought. The current shifts, just slightly, moving against its natural direction for the briefest moment, and the water touches the base of the vessel. If the river is meant to carry the curse away, then why does it feel as though something beneath the surface is reaching upward to receive it? The vessel does not enter the water fully, and that hesitation is not fear, but recognition, as though the priest senses that the river is no longer behaving as a passive force. The surface reflects the lamplight in broken fragments, and for a moment, you think it is only the current distorting the image, until the reflections begin to hold shapes that do not belong to anything standing on the shore. You are led back to the ritual chamber before the act is completed, because something has changed, something that cannot be resolved at the river alone. The effigy remains damp, untouched by full immersion, and is placed once more at the center of the marked floor. The air feels thicker now, almost resistant, and one of the younger priests brings forward an object wrapped in dark cloth, handling it with visible reluctance. When the cloth is removed, it reveals a mirror of polished obsidian, its surface so dark it seems to absorb, rather than reflect light. Obsidian mirrors were used in various ancient traditions, including in regions influenced by Mesopotamian trade, often associated with divination or communication with forces beyond ordinary perception. Yet this one behaves differently. When it is angled toward the room, it does not show the chamber. Instead, it reveals a landscape that feels distant yet immediate, a place of dim outlines and slow movement, where the ground appears uneven, almost layered with something that resembles sediment or bone. The priests do not speak, because this was not expected, or perhaps it was feared too much to be acknowledged openly. A peculiar detail found in certain fragmented texts suggests that mirrors used in high-level rituals were never meant to reflect truth, but to reveal agreements, showing not what is present, but what has been promised. The lead priest steps closer, his reflection absent, replaced by something that seems to shift just out of recognition. If this mirror reveals not the present, but the terms of a hidden bargain, then what agreement is being shown now, and who among them has already accepted it? The child's breathing changes before anyone speaks, drawing every gaze back to the cradle as though pulled by a single unseen thread. You stand close enough now to hear the shift clearly, the uneven rhythm smoothing into something deliberate, controlled, and far too steady for an infant weakened by fever. The room tightens around that sound, and the priests fall silent, not out of confusion, but because they recognize the moment they have been trying to delay. When the child opens its eyes, they do not focus on the mother. They move past her, settling somewhere just above and beyond, as though tracking a presence that does not belong to the visible world. In Mesopotamian incantation texts, there are warnings about voices that do not originate from the speaker, especially in cases involving Lamashtu, where possession was not always complete but partial, layered, as though two intentions could occupy the same body without fully displacing one another. The first word emerges slowly, shaped with care that no infant should possess. It is not a cry, but a statement. The voice is low, textured in a way that does not match the small frame from which it shifts, and though the language is ancient Akkadian, you understand it as though it has been translated directly into your thoughts. It speaks not in rage, but in certainty, and that certainty is far more unsettling. A detail preserved in several protective incantations claims that Lamashtu could borrow the breath of the young, not to inhabit them fully, but to speak through the space between life and sleep, where resistance is weakest. The child's lips move again, forming a second phrase, one that causes the lead priest to step back despite himself. It is a demand. Not for blood, not for sacrifice in the way one might expect, but for something unnamed, something the ritual has already begun to offer without understanding. The mother reaches forward instinctively, but one of the priests restrains her, shaking his head with quiet urgency. If Lamashtu is not asking for something new, but claiming something already given, then when did this offering truly begin, and who made it first? The answer arrives not in words, but in movement, as the air within the chamber shifts with a slow, deliberate weight, and the obsidian mirror darkens further until even the suggestion of reflection disappears. You feel it before you see it, a pressure along the edges of perception, like a door that has begun to open without sound. The priests step back in unison, not from instruction, but from instinct shaped by generations of ritual memory. At the far end of the chamber, a wooden structure that had gone unnoticed until now begins to change. It is a cedar door carved with symbols worn nearly smooth by time, its surface marked by faint inscriptions invoking Ereshkigal, the queen of the Underworld. Historically, cedar was prized in Mesopotamia, often imported and used in sacred architecture, particularly in structures meant to bridge symbolic boundaries between realms. Yet this door was never meant to open, and still it does. Not with force, but with a slow inward drift, as though something on the other side has released its hold. The hinges do not creak, and that absence of sound feels more unnatural than any noise could have been. Beyond the threshold, there is no clear space, only a dim expanse where depth seems uncertain, and the air that spills through carries a scent both dry and ancient, like stone sealed away from light for too long. A strange detail preserved in funerary texts suggests that doors associated with Ereshkigal were not barriers, but agreements, marking where passage was permitted under specific conditions that were rarely understood by the living. The child speaks again, softer now, as though no longer straining to be heard. The priests do not interrupt. They cannot. The boundary between worlds has already shifted, and whatever rules once governed it are no longer entirely in place. If the door to the underworld opens not by force but by permission, then who, in this room or beyond it, has allowed it to move? The answer writes itself across the sky, far beyond the reach of the chamber, yet felt within it as though the ceiling had dissolved into open night. One of the priests steps outside, drawn by a shift in light that does not belong to fire or dawn, and you follow into the open air, where the city of Babylon lies hushed under a growing shadow. The moon, once whole, is now being consumed, its edge darkened by a slow, deliberate encroachment that ancient astronomer priests would have recorded with both precision and dread. In Mesopotamian history, lunar eclipses were rarely seen as neutral events. They were interpreted as omens directed at kings, cities, or divine order itself, often requiring immediate ritual response to avert disaster. Yet this eclipse feels different, not like a warning, but like a confirmation. Back inside the chamber, the air tightens further, and the child's voice falls silent, as though something larger has begun to speak in its place. The cedar door remains open, its threshold now clearly defined by a darkness that does not spread, but deepens inward. The obsidian mirror reflects the same void, aligning two separate spaces into a single shared presence. A peculiar detail from Babylonian omen texts notes that during certain eclipses, rivers were believed to hesitate, their currents slowing or even reversing for brief moments, as though responding to forces beyond earthly gravity. At the edge of your hearing, beneath the layered sounds of breath and distant wind, you think you detect it, the faintest suggestion of water moving against itself. The lead priest lowers his gaze, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, and for the first time since the ritual began, he stops speaking entirely. The silence that follows is not empty. It is accepted. If the eclipse signals that a blood price has been recognized by the cosmos itself, then the question no longer concerns what must be given, but something far more unsettling. Who has already agreed to pay it? No one volunteers at first, and that absence stretches long enough to become its own kind of answer, until a quiet movement near the back of the chamber draws every eye without a word being spoken. You turn and see him step forward, not with confidence, but with a steadiness that feels practiced, as though he has already made this decision long before this night demanded it. He is young, no more than 20 summers, with a small satchel at his side filled with lapis beads, the kind traded along routes that once connected distant cities across Mesopotamia. In historical records, lapis lazuli was prized not only for its color, but for its association with the divine, often used in amulets and offerings believed to bridge mortal and celestial realms. The young man sets the satchel down carefully, as though acknowledging the life he is stepping away from, and when he speaks, his voice is quiet but clear enough to carry through the chamber. He does not ask what will happen. He already knows enough. The lead priest studies him for a long moment, then nods once, not in approval, but in recognition of a role that has just been claimed. In ancient ritual structures, there is often a figure who crosses the threshold when others cannot, not because they are chosen by the gods, but because they are willing to accept the cost without fully understanding it. A strange detail from certain underworld descent myths, including parallels found in both Greek mythology and earlier Mesopotamian traditions, suggests that those who carry objects between realms must never look directly at what they are delivering, as recognition can bind them to it permanently. The effigy is placed back into the young man's hands, its surface now colder than before, as though it has absorbed something from the open door. He steps toward the threshold. The darkness does not resist him. If he is not chosen by the gods, but steps forward by his own will, then what part of him has already crossed over before his body follows? The first step does not feel like movement, but like subtraction, as though something loosens from you the moment your foot crosses the threshold, leaving behind a trace you cannot quite name. You follow him in awareness, if not in body, drawn into the same descending path that ancient texts only describe in fragments. The air shifts immediately, growing heavier yet strangely hollow, and the sounds of the chamber above fade not into silence, but into distance that stretches beyond measure. This is the descending road. In Mesopotamian myth, most famously in the tale of Inanna's descent, the journey into the underworld requires passing through successive gates, each one stripping away a layer of identity, status, or protection. Though this path is not marked by visible gates, the effect unfolds in a similar pattern. The young man takes another step, and something in his posture changes, subtle but undeniable, as though a memory has slipped out of reach. He pauses, not because he chooses to, but because the absence registers. A detail preserved in lesser-known ritual commentaries suggests that those who descend in such rites may lose not only memories, but sensory associations, such as the ability to recall the color of lapis or the sound of their own name spoken aloud. This is not lost through force, but through exchange. The effigy in his hands grows lighter, or perhaps he grows less able to feel its weight. The path beneath him is not solid in the way earth should be, but layered, as though composed of compressed remnants, each step pressing into something that yields without breaking. There is no visible source of light, yet the shapes ahead remain just clear enough to follow. He takes another step. Another. And with each one, something unravels quietly, without resistance. If every step downward takes something from him, not by theft but by balance, then when he reaches the end of this path, what will remain that still belongs to the world above? The path does not end so much as it settles, widening into a space that feels less like a destination and more like a holding place for something that has refused to dissolve. You arrive with him at what can only be described as the lowest point, though direction has long since lost its meaning, and the ground beneath is no longer layered in shifting texture, but fixed, composed of something pale and uneven that reflects no light. It is only when he steps closer that the shape becomes clear. Bones. Not scattered, not broken in chaos, but arranged with deliberate care, forming a structure that resembles a cradle, its curved edges rising gently as though meant to hold rather than contain. The effigy in his hands trembles slightly, though his grip has not changed, and the air here carries a stillness so complete that even the concept of breath feels intrusive. In Mesopotamian demonology, Lamashtu is often depicted standing upon a donkey nursing animals and surrounded by symbols of inversion, yet there are obscure references in certain incantations that hint at something more personal, describing her as one who remembers what was taken before it was named. Scholars have debated this line for generations, unsure whether it refers to lost children or something else entirely. Strange detail appears in a fragmentary text discovered near Sipar, claiming that Lamashtu once fashioned a cradle not for what she hunted, but for what she could no longer reach, though the text breaks before clarifying what that meant. The young man kneels without being told. The effigy lowers slowly into the hollow of bone, fitting with a precision that suggests this place was always waiting for it. The moment it settles, a faint sound moves through the space, not quite a voice, not quite a memory, but something in between. The air shifts, and for the first time you sense her not as presence but as proximity. If this cradle was not made for her victims but for something she lost, then what exactly has been placed into it now, and why does it feel like a return rather than an offering? The realization does not arrive as a revelation spoken aloud, but as a slow alignment of details that have been waiting, scattered and incomplete, now drawing together into something far more unsettling than any single truth. You feel it as the space around the cradle shifts, not outward but inward, as though attention itself has weight, and it is now focused entirely on what rests within that fragile curve of bone. She is here. Not as a form you can fully see, but as a presence that defines the space by what it alters. The air grows denser, and there is a faint scent that does not belong to decay, but to something older, like dried milk and cold stone, a combination that should not coexist, yet does. In Mesopotamian tradition, Lamashtu is described as a devourer of infants, a tormentor of mothers, a figure invoked in fear and resisted through ritual, yet there are fragments, rare, often overlooked, that suggest a different dimension to her existence. The young man does not lift his head because something in him understands that recognition must not be forced. The sound begins again, the same tone that once emerged from the child, but now fuller, deeper, layered with something that resembles memory rather than hunger. It moves through the space like a fragment of a lullaby, incomplete yet deliberate, carrying with it a sense of repetition that feels practiced over an uncountable span of time. A peculiar detail from a lesser-known Akkadian incantation describes Lamashtu as one who counts what cannot be kept, a phrase long interpreted as a reference to her victims, but here it shifts meaning, becoming something far more intimate. The cradle does not feel like a trap. It feels like an echo. And then, without warning, the understanding settles fully into place, not as something you are told, but as something you recognize. She does not take because she desires. She takes because she cannot stop remembering. If her hunger is not driven by malice but by an endless grief that repeats itself, then what kind of curse could transform memory into something that must be fed to survive? The understanding does not soften her presence. Instead, it sharpens it into something far more dangerous, because grief that endures without release does not fade. It deepens, reshapes, and eventually demands structure. You feel that structure forming now, not in the space itself, but in the exchange that is about to take place. The young man lifts his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge what stands before him, though his eyes never fully meet what cannot be seen. In Mesopotamian ritual logic, bargains are rarely spoken in full sentences. They are formed through gesture, offering, and a single word that binds intention to consequence. The effigy rests within the cradle, no longer trembling, as though it has completed its purpose, and the silence that follows is not empty, but expectant. He speaks. One word. It is not loud, not forceful, but it carries with it the weight of recognition, as though he is naming something that has already been present long before he arrived. The moment the word leaves him, the space shifts, not violently, but with a quiet finality that feels irreversible. You sense it immediately, something has been accepted. Strange detail from ancient incantation traditions suggests that certain oaths, once spoken in the presence of underworld forces, cannot be undone even by the gods, because they are not governed by divine authority, but by balance itself. These are not promises, they are exchanges. The cradle responds. Not by movement but by absence, as though something within it has been taken or perhaps returned. The faint lullaby fades, replaced by a stillness that feels almost complete, yet not entirely resolved. Far above, though you cannot see it from here, the eclipse continues. And within the young man, something has already begun to change, not visibly, but fundamentally, as though a part of him has been rewritten in a language that no longer belongs to the living world. If a single word can seal a bargain with something born of grief, then what exactly did he give, and more importantly, what has he agreed to carry back with him? The return does not begin with movement upward, but with resistance, as though the path itself questions whether anything that has crossed so far down should be allowed to retrace its steps unchanged. You sense it immediately in the young man's posture, in the way his breathing resumes with a rhythm that no longer fully aligns with the world above. The effigy remains behind, settled into the cradle of bone, yet something unseen travels with him now, not as weight, but as presence. He turns. And in that turning, the air fractures. It begins as a wind, familiar yet altered, carrying the same dry heat that once pressed against the chamber walls, but now it moves with direction, with intent that feels less like protection and more like interruption. Pazuzu arrives not from above but from within the threshold itself, as though he has always occupied the space between descent and return. In Assyrian iconography, Pazuzu is often depicted as both guardian and corrupter, a figure whose intervention is never without motive, and whose protection exists within a system of exchange rather than loyalty. His form does not fully reveal itself, yet his presence is unmistakable, marked by that same coiling pressure in the air, by a sound that resembles breath layered over distance. A peculiar detail from certain ritual tablets suggests that Pazuzu was not merely an adversary of Lamashtu, but a regulator of her reach, ensuring that her influence did not extend beyond what had been permitted in older agreements between forces that predate human record. The young man does not stop walking, but something in him slows, as though another will has begun to intersect with his own. The path behind him shifts slightly, not closing, but narrowing, as though time itself is being adjusted. And then you understand. This was never a rescue. It was a balance. If Pazuzu has been present on both sides of this exchange, guiding what enters and what returns, then what has he been taking for himself each time this cycle repeats? The fracture reaches the surface before the young man does. Back in the chamber, the lead priest resumes the incantation, his voice steady at first, shaped by years of repetition and discipline. Yet something in the rhythm no longer aligns with what was begun earlier in the night. The Maqlû series was never meant to be interrupted and resumed, because each line builds upon the last, forming a structure that depends on continuity. Now that structure has been broken. You hear it in a single syllable. It falters. Not loudly, not enough for an untrained ear to notice, but here, within a ritual that depends on precision, that slight deviation opens a space that should not exist. The lamps flicker inward again, their flames bending toward the center, as though drawn by a breath that is not part of the room. The obsidian mirror darkens further until even its surface seems to recede. In ancient ritual texts, there are warnings about incomplete incantations, describing them as paths without closure, capable of inviting forces that were never named, because the boundary between invocation and absence becomes unstable. This is not failure in the ordinary sense, it is transformation. The cedar door remains open, but something else steps through. It is not Lamashtu. That much is clear, not because she is absent, but because this presence does not carry the weight of memory or grief. Instead, it feels structured, deliberate, like a force that has been waiting not to enter, but to be allowed. A strange detail recorded in certain exorcistic commentaries suggests that when a ritual breaks at the wrong moment, it does not simply lose power, it reverses direction, turning protection into passage. The priest tries to correct the line, to reshape the sound, but the words no longer belong to him in the way they once did. And in that widening gap between what is spoken and what is meant, something ancient finds its way through. If this presence is neither the demon they feared, nor the force they invoked, then what exactly has answered the space created by a broken word? The answer arrives with the sky. The eclipse reaches its deepest point, and for a brief, suspended moment, the moon disappears entirely, leaving behind a darkness that feels complete rather than empty, as though something has closed rather than been obscured. You stand between worlds now, aware of both at once, as the chamber and the city beyond it fall into a shared stillness that no human voice can break. Then the river responds. Far beyond the temple walls, the Euphrates shifts, not violently but unmistakably, its current slowing and bending against its natural course. Ancient Babylonian omen texts describe such moments as signs that the boundary between divine will and earthly order has thinned, allowing forces usually kept apart to overlap, if only briefly. The priests feel it without seeing it, their bodies tensing as though the ground itself has changed beneath them. Inside the chamber, the air tightens to its limit. The young man steps through the cedar threshold at last, emerging not with triumph but with a stillness that feels almost absent. His eyes remain open, yet there is something missing behind them, not emptiness, but distance, as though part of him has remained below by agreement rather than loss. A faint mark appears at his throat, not a wound, but a shadowed line that pulses once, then fades into the skin. Some incantation texts speak of such markings as signatures of passage, indicators that a crossing has been completed and recognized by both sides. The lead priest lowers his head. He understands. The blood price has been paid, though no blade was raised, no visible sacrifice made. The exchange has already occurred, written not in action but in balance. The wind that marked Pazuzu's presence recedes, not gone but withdrawn, as though his role in this moment has concluded. And somewhere beyond sight, something has been satisfied. If no life was visibly taken, yet the price has been fulfilled, then what exactly has been given up, and will it ever truly return? The silence that follows is not relief, but recalibration, as though the world itself is adjusting to a change that cannot be undone. The eclipse begins to release its hold, a thin edge of light returning to the moon, yet the chamber does not brighten with it. You remain within a space that has already crossed too far to return to what it was before. The young man stands at the center, the place where the effigy once rested, and though he breathes, though his body remains intact, something in his presence feels redistributed, as if he now occupies himself only partially. The mother moves toward the cradle, drawn by instinct stronger than fear, and when she looks down, the child is no longer struggling. The breathing is steady, natural. The faint mark behind the ear, the crescent shape whispered about in old incantations, has faded completely, leaving no trace that anything had ever been there. In Mesopotamian protective traditions, such a sudden restoration would be interpreted as successful expulsion, yet the priests do not speak the words of completion. Because they know. A strange detail preserved in certain ritual commentaries suggests that not all expulsions remove a presence entirely. Some transform its expression, redirecting it rather than ending it. These are considered the most dangerous outcomes, not because they fail, but because they succeed in ways that cannot be easily seen. The cedar door closes without sound. The obsidian mirror clears, reflecting the chamber once more, though for a brief moment, you think you see something behind the reflection, something that watches without needing to remain. And then it is gone. What remains is quieter than before, yet heavier, as though something has been resolved in one place and transferred to another. The lead priest finally lifts his gaze, not toward the child, but toward the young man, and in that look there is no gratitude, only recognition. If Lamashtu has not been destroyed, but has chosen to act differently in this final moment, then what exactly has she changed? And who will carry the weight of that choice from this night forward? The answer does not announce itself, because what has changed is not meant to be witnessed all at once, but discovered slowly in the quiet spaces where certainty begins to thin. The chamber empties in careful silence, each priest departing with measured steps, as though unwilling to disturb what is settled. The mother remains with her child, holding him close, unaware that what has been restored may not be what was originally there, yet unable to question the relief that now steadies her breath. You remain. Drawn not to the living, but to the record. The clay tablet lies where it was first brought, its surface marked with the same careful lines, the same warning etched deeper than the rest. In ancient Mesopotamian culture, tablets were not merely records but anchors, objects that fixed events into memory so they could not shift or be forgotten. Yet this one feels unfinished in a way that resists explanation. You kneel beside it. The stylus rests nearby. A peculiar detail known from cuneiform practice is that unfinished tablets were sometimes deliberately left incomplete to prevent the full invocation of what they described, as though writing itself could cross into action if carried too far. The final line waits. Not broken, not erased, but paused. The name. You can feel it forming, not in sound, but in intention, as though the act of completing it does not require voice, only will. The warning remains clear, do not finish the name. And yet everything that has unfolded suggests that this was never a prohibition meant to be obeyed forever, but a delay. A choice extended across time. The air in the chamber holds steady, but beneath that stillness, there is a quiet awareness, something that has not left, only shifted its attention. The story has not ended. It has been handed forward. If the tablet was left incomplete so that someone, somewhere, would one day finish what was begun, then why does it feel as though that moment was always meant to be now? The night softens slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though the world itself is careful not to disturb what has settled into place. The temple no longer feels suspended between forces, and the air, once heavy with tension, begins to loosen, carrying with it only the faint scent of oil and cooled stone. Somewhere beyond the walls, the river resumes its natural rhythm, its surface smoothing, as though nothing had ever asked it to change. You step away from the chamber, though part of your awareness lingers behind, not out of fear, but because something within the story has taken root in a quieter way. The name is no longer sharp at the edges of your thoughts, yet it has not faded either. It rests there patient like an echo that does not need to repeat itself to be remembered. In the distance, the first suggestion of dawn begins to gather, not as light, but as a softening of darkness, a gradual return rather than a sudden shift. The world continues as it always does, carrying forward both what is seen and what remains just beneath it. There are stories in every tradition, whether in Greek mythology, Norse legends, or the ancient mysteries of Mesopotamia, that do not end with resolution, but with continuation, passing quietly from one voice to another, from one listener to the next. This is one of them. You breathe more evenly now. The tension has passed, but something else remains, something quieter, deeper, and far less urgent. And as the last traces of night dissolve, the silence that follows feels less like absence and more like understanding.